if you were standing in this hall in 1350, is 500 bodies rotting inside their finest clothes, sealed under layers of silk that haven't touched water in months. You were taught to worship these women. I went through the archives, and what I found underneath the crowns, the velvet, and the gold is a biological nightmare that no painting was ever allowed to show you. Let me ask you something. When you picture a medieval queen, what do you see? Gold thread catching candlelight, velvet so deep it looks like liquid, a woman draped in the most expensive fabric ever produced by human hands. Now let me tell you what that fabric actually was, biologically speaking, after 3 months of continuous wear. It was a second skin, a decomposing, fermenting, bacteria-saturated second skin. And she couldn't take it off. A formal royal gown in 14th century Europe wasn't a piece of clothing. It was a structural garment. Historians and textile scholars who have studied surviving pieces from this period, including inventories from the French royal court under the Valois dynasty, have documented gowns reinforced with wire, weighted with gold embroidery, and layered across multiple undergarments that could, combined, exceed 10 kilograms of material on a single body. 10 kilograms. That's the weight of a small child strapped to your torso every single day in a hall with no ventilation and fireplaces burning at full capacity. And none of it, not one layer, was ever submerged in water. This is where the forensic picture becomes genuinely disturbing. The sweat produced by a body under that kind of thermal and physical stress doesn't evaporate. It has nowhere to go. Instead, it saturates the innermost layers of linen, dries, resaturates the next day, and begins to form what textile biologists would recognize as a biofilm, a layered colony of organic material composed of dead skin cells, sebaceous secretions, and microbial growth. Over weeks, that biofilm hardens. It becomes structural. Scholars examining preserved undergarments from Royal European collections have noted stiffening and discoloration consistent with months of continuous biological deposit. The fabric wasn't just dirty, it had been biologically colonized. But here's the detail that the court physicians of 1350 would have defended with complete conviction. They believed this was not only acceptable, they believed it was medically correct. The innermost linen shirt, pressed directly against the queen's skin, was understood through the lens of Galenic medicine as what I can only describe as a linen cheat code. The prevailing medical logic, documented in texts like the Taquinum Sanitatis, a 14th century health handbook widely circulated among European nobility, held that linen possessed an almost magnetic property. It was believed to draw impurities outward from the body, pulling toxins through the pores and into the fabric itself, effectively cleaning the body from the outside in. Washing that shirt would destroy the medicine. You would be throwing away the cure. So the queen's physicians actively discouraged laundering. And the queen, surrounded by the finest medical minds her kingdom could afford, sat inside a biological prison of her own clothing, sealed under 10 kilograms of velvet and gold, while a hardening crust of her own biological output pressed against every inch of her skin. What makes this forensically remarkable isn't the discomfort. It's the pathogen loading potential. Warm, moist, oxygen-limited environments between fabric layers are ideal incubation conditions for bacteria, including Staphylococcus and Streptococcus strains. Chronic skin infections, boils, and open sores were so common among medieval royalty that they appear repeatedly in court medical records, often attributed to divine punishment or imbalanced humors, never once connected to the obvious biological cause, sitting directly against the skin every hour of every day. And if you think the dress was the worst of it, you haven't heard what was happening underneath it. Now picture this. You are a foreign diplomat. You have traveled 6 weeks by horse to negotiate a trade agreement with the most powerful woman in Europe. You are standing in a gilded reception hall, speaking carefully chosen words through an interpreter, and the queen, draped in that 10-kilogram gown, is listening. She nods. She responds. And somewhere underneath all that velvet and gold, she is actively urinating. This was not a scandal. This was court protocol. The device that made it possible was called the bourdaloue, a narrow, elongated porcelain vessel, small enough to be concealed beneath the layers of a royal skirt. Ladies-in-waiting were trained to position it silently, without interrupting the queen's conversation, while the outer skirts created a curtain of fabric that concealed the entire act from the room. Royal household accounts from the French court, including records preserved in the Comte de l'Hôtel du Roi, document the regular maintenance and replacement of these vessels as standard royal inventory. This wasn't improvised, it was institutionalized. And when the vessel was full, it had to go somewhere. That somewhere was a corridor, then a window. The waste disposal system of a 14th century royal palace was, in its most accurate description, gravity and distance. Chamber pots, including the bourdaloue collected from beneath the queen's skirts, were carried through the same hallways lined with tapestries worth more than entire villages, and emptied into exterior moats or simply thrown from upper-story windows onto the ground below. Excavations at multiple medieval palace sites across France and England have uncovered dense waste deposits directly beneath window lines, confirming what the historical record describes. The biological irony here is brutal. The queen, who could not afford to expose her skin to water because her physicians told her it would kill her, was generating biological waste in the middle of diplomatic ceremonies, carried by hand through corridors of gold and discarded out of a window. The most protected, most medically supervised woman in the kingdom was living inside a system of waste management that a modern field sanitation unit would reject. And the contamination didn't stop at the floor. It was climbing straight up into her hair. What you are about to hear is going to permanently change the way you look at royal portraits. Every painting you have ever seen of a medieval or early modern queen shows the same thing above the neck, an architectural masterpiece of hair. Towers of curls, braids woven with pearls, elaborate constructions that framed the face like a crown in themselves. What those paintings never showed you was the biological reality of what was holding that hair in place, and what was living inside it. The primary fixative used in royal hairstyling throughout the medieval and early modern period was animal fat, specifically rendered lard, the same substance used in kitchens, applied directly to the hair and scalp to provide hold, structure, and a surface to which ornaments, powder, and additional hairpieces could adhere. This is documented in cosmetic and household manuals of the period, including the Trotula, a 12th century medical compendium widely used by court physicians across Europe well into the 14th century, which references fat-based preparations for hair maintenance among noble women as standard practice. Now apply basic biology to that information. You have a warm human scalp, generating heat constantly. You have a thick layer of animal fat sitting directly on that scalp, providing a rich lipid environment. You have layers of fabric and ornament trapping that heat from above. And you have a woman who has not washed her hair in months, because water, again, was medically contraindicated by the finest physicians her kingdom could produce. What you have created is not a hairstyle. You have created an incubator of parasites. Pediculus humanus capitis, the human head louse, thrives in exactly these conditions. Warm, nutrient-rich, undisturbed. Medieval chronicles and court records from across Europe make repeated, almost casual references to the presence of lice among the nobility. The Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, a first-hand chronicle of 15th century Parisian life, documents lice as a universal condition across all social classes, including explicitly among the court. What historians have documented from royal household accounts is even more revealing. The role of the épouleur or épouleuse, a designated court attendant whose specific function was the daily removal of lice and parasites from the bodies of the royal family, was a recognized salaried position in several European courts. Let that settle for a moment. The queen had a professional lice hunter on the payroll. This was not an emergency measure. It was a scheduled part of the morning routine, listed alongside dressing and prayer and household accounts. The infestation was so consistent, so guaranteed, that it required a dedicated staff member to manage it daily. And even then, it was managed, never eliminated, because elimination would have required the one thing medicine had forbidden: water. The head louse also carries a secondary threat that the 14th century had no framework to understand. Lice are a documented vector for Bartonella quintana, the bacterium responsible for trench fever, and under certain conditions contribute to the transmission of epidemic typhus via body lice populations that spread between garments. A royal court where physical proximity was mandatory, where garments were shared between ladies in waiting, where embraces and close contact were political acts, was not a protected environment. It was a transmission network, dressed in silk, perfumed with roses, and operating as a biological relay system for parasitic infection. And that transmission network had its most dangerous moment 3 times a day, when everyone sat down to eat. Here is something that no royal portrait, no illuminated manuscript, no romanticized historical drama will ever show you. The most powerful woman in 14th century Europe, the woman whose word could end a war or start one, ate with her hands, unwashed hands, Hands that had touched her hair, her face, her clothing, and everything else her biological reality demanded throughout the day. And she reached those hands into a shared dish at a table surrounded by 50 other people doing the exact same thing. Medieval royal dining was not the sanitized pageant of cinema. It was a communal biological event with essentially no contamination barriers whatsoever. The concept of individual place settings as we understand them, separate plates, personal utensils, individual cups, was largely absent from 14th century court dining. Historical records from royal household accounts in England and France consistently describe shared trenchers, common serving vessels, and the near-total absence of individual cutlery beyond a personal knife each diner carried for themselves. Forks in the 14th century were a novelty so exotic that when a fork appeared in the royal inventory of Charles V of France, it was recorded as a curiosity rather than a dining instrument. What this means forensically is that every person at that table was introducing their personal microbial load directly into shared food. A single communal dish reached into by 30 hands over the course of a meal becomes what a modern microbiologist would classify as a high pathogen loading contact surface within minutes. The wine cup passed between guests, lips to ceramic to lips, was functionally identical to a shared syringe in terms of pathogen transfer potential. And this was happening at the peak of the bubonic plague. The Black Death had already killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population by the mid-14th century, according to demographic analyses published in peer-reviewed historical epidemiology research. And the royal court, convinced of its own divine protection, was operating a daily bacterial exchange program in the middle of the deadliest pandemic the continent had ever seen. The absence of soap is the detail that clinches it. True soap, saponified fat with genuine antimicrobial properties, existed in medieval Europe but was neither widely used nor understood in any functional hygiene context. Hands were rinsed with water between courses at formal banquets, documented in etiquette manuals like the Livre des Manières of Étienne de Fougères, but rinsing with water alone without any surfactant removes surface debris while leaving the microbial population on the skin almost entirely intact. The ritual looked like hygiene. Biologically, it accomplished almost nothing. The food itself carried its own risks before it even reached the table. Medieval food preservation relied on salt, smoke, and spice, the latter famously expensive and therefore a direct marker of royal status. The heavy use of spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon at royal tables has sometimes been romanticized as simple culinary preference. Food historians, including Dr. Paul Friedman of Yale University, in his research on medieval spice trade and consumption, have documented that spices served a partially masking function, covering the sensory evidence of spoilage in meat that had been stored without refrigeration for days or weeks. The queen was not eating well-preserved food seasoned for pleasure. She was frequently eating compromised food heavily spiced to disguise the biological reality, consumed with unwashed hands from shared vessels, at a table where no one had a coherent understanding of how disease actually spread. The miracle, the genuine forensic miracle, is not that medieval royalty died young. It is that any of them survived long enough to produce heirs at all. But even this catastrophic picture of contamination and pathogen exposure had one more layer underneath it. Because when these women got sick, and they did constantly, the doctors arrived, and the doctors made everything worse. Here is the cruel irony at the center of everything you have heard today. The peasant woman drawing water from a village well and bathing in a river twice a month was, by every measurable biological standard, cleaner than her queen. The woman with no crown, no physicians, no velvet, and no gold was surviving in a body that functioned closer to what human biology actually requires. And the queen, surrounded by the most educated medical minds in Europe, protected by wealth that could purchase anything the known world produced, was being systematically destroyed by the advice of the people paid to keep her alive. Medieval European medicine in the 14th century operated almost entirely within the framework of miasma theory and Galenic humoral doctrine. Miasma theory held that disease originated from corrupted air, toxic vapors rising from decomposing matter, swamps, and filth. It was a theory with no microbial foundation whatsoever, and it produced medical conclusions that were, in modern terms, catastrophically wrong. Among the most dangerous was the medical consensus on bathing. The logic, documented in medical texts including the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, one of the most widely distributed medical reference works in medieval Europe, held that hot water opened the pores of the skin, and open pores were direct pathways for miasma to enter the body. Bathing, particularly in warm water, was understood as an act of biological vulnerability. For a common person, the risk might be acceptable. For a queen whose death would destabilize an entire kingdom, it was medically unconscionable. This was not ignorance in the casual sense. These were credentialed scholars who had studied for decades, who read Latin and Arabic medical texts, who had access to the accumulated medical knowledge of the ancient world, filtered through centuries of European and Islamic scholarship. And every single one of them had reached the same catastrophically incorrect conclusion. Water was a vector of death, and keeping it away from royal skin was an act of medical protection. The queen, therefore, was left with one available tool for managing the biological reality of her own body: chemistry. Specifically, the overwhelming application of animal-based perfumes, predominantly musk derived from the musk deer gland, civet paste extracted from the anal glands of the civet cat, and ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales. These were the most expensive olfactory substances on Earth, and their purpose was not pleasure. It was biological camouflage. A body that had not contacted water in months, sealed inside fermenting garments, producing the full output of human biological function without any mechanism of removal, generates a sensory signature that no flower-based perfume can touch. Only the most aggressive animal-derived compounds, themselves carrying heavy, organic, almost decomposition-adjacent scent profiles, could compete with what was underneath. Contemporary accounts, including diplomatic correspondence and the memoirs of foreign court visitors preserved in European state archives, occasionally contain oblique references to the overwhelming sensory environment of royal audiences. The combination of hundreds of bodies, animal fat-based cosmetics, fermenting garments, and industrial quantities of musk and civet created an olfactory atmosphere that modern forensic reconstruction would classify as immediately hazardous to respiratory comfort. This was the smell of power in 1350. This was what it meant to stand in the presence of greatness. And the queen at the center of it all, the woman the perfume was designed to protect, was breathing it too, every day, inside a biological prison constructed by the people who loved her most and understood her body least. I want you to look at the table in front of me one more time. The gold, the candles, the meat that has been sitting here long enough that I can tell you without testing it, that it is already compromised. The wine in that shared cup, the hands that have touched everything in this room and will now reach into that dish. We have spent our entire cultural inheritance worshiping these women. We built museums for their dresses. We wrote operas about their romances. We named perfumes after them. And what the forensic record actually shows, the household accounts, the medical texts, the textile analyses, the archaeological waste deposits, is something that no portrait was ever commissioned to capture. It shows women trapped inside a system of biological negligence so complete, so institutionalized, so confidently wrong, that the very people responsible for their survival were accelerating their deterioration. They were not goddesses. They were not fragile porcelain figures behind glass. They were human beings, with full human biology, full human output, and full human vulnerability to infection and disease, placed inside a framework that denied every one of those biological realities in the name of status, medical theory, and the theater of power. The peasant bathed, the queen rotted in silk, and the doctors took notes. So the next time you stand under a shower, hot water, soap, the most ordinary luxury in the modern world, understand what you are actually holding. Something that the wealthiest, most powerful, most medically attended women in human history were categorically denied. Not because it didn't exist, because the smartest people in the room told them it would kill them. The archive is closed. If this investigation changed the way you see history, then do something the Queen never had access to, a clean, simple action. Subscribe to The Vault. Not because an algorithm needs feeding, but because the next file we open goes somewhere even darker than this one, and you are going to want to be in the room when it does. Drop a comment below telling me which detail from today hit you hardest. The Bordaloo, the lice hunter on the royal payroll, or the doctors who made everything worse. And if you think someone you know still believes the fairy tale version of medieval royalty, send them this video. Let the archive do the work. We'll see you in the next one.